Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Danielle Fisher, and I'm the event manager here at Eco Canada. And today's session is called Guide to Climate Action by Small and Medium Enterprises, Series 4. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to recognize the traditional Indigenous lands where Eco Canada's office is based in Calgary. At Eco Canada, we're committed to working towards respectful acknowledgement, collaboration, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples across Canada. This starts with acknowledging our honor and privilege to live and work within the Treaty 7 territory. Today, we are presenting from the city of Calgary, home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We would also like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Niitsitapi, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina and Goodstoney, which include the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping guidelines for today's session to ensure that everyone can enjoy and participate in our session effectively. All participants are muted, so please check your audio settings to ensure that you can hear us properly. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the question box and select Eco Canada, the organizer, and I will do all that I can to resolve the issue. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand to you within the next 24 hours. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive an email with a link to the video. Any questions that you have about the presentation or today's topic can be submitted through the chat box or question box. We will have dedicated time after the presentation to answer any questions from the audience. And finally, we really want to know what you think about our webinars and how we can keep improving. You'll be sent a short survey after the webinar ends. Please let us know what you think or if you have any comments or suggestions about the webinar. Eco Canada's vision is to build the world's leading environmental workforce. Eco Canada seeks to help environmental workers succeed at each step of their career journey. To do this, Eco Canada has developed programs tailored to individuals at different stages of their career. For those looking to enter the environmental workforce, Eco Canada provides training through the BEAR program and accreditation for environmental programs at post-secondary institutions. Eco Canada also provides opportunities for new workers to break into the environmental sector through wage funding for co-op students and recent post-secondary graduates. For those already employed as environmental workers, Eco Canada provides the environmental professional and environmental professional in training certifications and EPT students. Lastly, Eco Canada provides opportunities for those with vast experience as environmental workers to provide guidance and direction to Eco Canada's products and programs through advisory committees and emeritus memberships. I would like to introduce Amy Zell. Amy is the Technical Director of Voluntary Carbon Markets at the International Emissions Trading Association. Amy is passionate for the way carbon markets balance economic imperatives with environmental realities, and she is dedicated to amplifying these markets and seeing them reach their full potential. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Excuse the cold, the meds haven't kicked in yet, so pardon my raspy voice. And also I'm looking at the presentation on this other screen, just so you know where my head is at. Very excited to speak with you today about carbon offsetting. Our agenda is pretty simple. I do think in order to understand the carbon accounting components, we need to start at a higher level and look at carbon markets as a whole, which is why we'll talk about global markets, national and subnational, and then the voluntary market, before diving into some principles and some accounting. But first, who am I and why am I here speaking to you? I'm wearing a few different hats today. As I was introduced, I am the Technical Director for Voluntary Carbon Markets at AIDA. AIDA is a nonprofit membership association with over 300 member companies, and we represent the business voice to carbon markets. I'm also the founder and lead consultant at Outset Carbon Consulting. So if you are looking for any independent advisory services based on what we're talking about today, please do reach out. And finally, I am an instructor with Saga Wisdom. So if you want more information on the things that we're talking about, please do view my course through the Saga platform. Now, I don't think I need to say these today, given the audience, but you never know. So like a good engineer, I will state my assumptions. The first one being climate change is real and is being accelerated by humans. And two, there's a price on carbon. And I say this to sort of set the stage and let you know I will help you take advantage of these systems and make the most of carbon pricing with what we'll talk about today. So with that, we will dive in. I love this slide from the World Bank because it shows just how many jurisdictions in the world have carbon pricing schemes. And you can sort of see where some of those hotspots are. So where we are in Canada, a bit of a patchwork, we'll get to that in a second. We see some states with their own carbon pricing schemes, nothing at the federal level in the US. There's a lot of activity in Europe. Obviously, Europe has the ETS, the emissions trading system. But where we're seeing a lot of growth is in Asia as well as in Latin America. This is really just a scene setter to give you a look at where compliance markets exist in the world. Ooh, clicked on the wrong thing. I'll use my little pointers. Perfect. Okay, so what are we talking about when we say carbon pricing? Carbon pricing is an economic signal, and it allows the markets and market participants to determine where emissions can be reduced at the lowest cost. Now, carbon pricing is typically part of carbon markets or compliance systems. It would be considered compliance when it's run by the government, and these typically fall into three main categories. Cap and trade, most common. This is looking at an absolute emissions value, so it's a volume-based policy. California has a cap and trade, the EU ETS is a cap and trade system, and there's a declining cap, meaning all of the regulated entities of the companies within that cap cannot emit more than the volume the government has determined. Functionally very similar, but structurally different to the middle option there, an output-based pricing system. This is the most common approach in Canada, and instead of having a cap or a limit on the total volumes, an output-based pricing system regulates the price per ton of carbon. So in Canada, the carbon price is $80 per ton, increasing $15 per ton to $170 by 2030. The government is looking at facilitating emission reductions by increasing the price. The third option under compliance is a carbon tax. In Canada, this looks like the federal fuel charge, also called the carbon levy. And this is a fixed fee it's typically on like a per volume of fuel. So we pay the carbon tax every time we're buying gas at the pump or natural gas to heat our homes. It's complementary for the federal government to the output-based pricing system. When we talk about carbon pricing, there are also voluntary markets, which we'll get into, and this is what I spend all of my time looking at these days, but also Article 6. And Article 6 is of the Paris Agreement, which I think we'll talk about on the next slide. Yes, okay. So the Paris Agreement, super high level. It is an international treaty signed in 2015 where every country sets its own target called their nationally determined contribution, or their NDC, in line with global goals. And the global goals are to limit temperature rise or limit global warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius and achieve net zero by 2050. So of the Paris Agreement, when we're thinking about emissions trading and carbon pricing, what we're really focused on is Article 6. And so if you're in the space, you probably hear a lot about it. I'm going to spend a minute here explaining what it is and why do we care. So from Article 6, there are two subsections that are relevant to us, Article 6.2 and 6.4. 6.2 is government to government. So this is transactions between, the first transaction happened a few weeks ago. The Swiss government bought carbon credits from the Thai government in Thailand. So they're actually trading those emissions, and the Swiss government is reducing their national inventory based on the volume of credits that they bought. It's government to government. It's typically not private sector involvement, and this is a framework for how government should think about those transactions. 6.4 is a little bit different, and it's not operational yet, Article 6.4 is its own crediting mechanism. And this would allow countries to develop credits if they don't have their own offset system or carbon crediting system. But it looks a lot like the voluntary market, except the credits that are traded can be used towards nationally determined contributions. Can go into a lot more detail. I'm going to leave it high level, but ask any questions if you're curious about that. Bringing it into Canada, I think since we are here with Eco Canada, it's important to look at what's going on in our country and hit on a few of the key policies or the frameworks that you're probably often hearing about. The first would be the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, an absolute mouthful, but a pretty important piece of legislation because this acts as it's put in place rather, what we call the federal backstop. And the federal backstop is a set of stringency requirements that each province must meet in its own emissions pricing system. And if the province does not meet those requirements, the federal backstop would apply. So you can see here where provinces and territories have an equivalent system. This means that they're completely managed at the provincial level, like Quebec. Quebec has a cap and trade system linked with California. We can see, in the Yukon, Nunavut, and Manitoba, there's the federal system that applies. So they did not bother, they did not try to, or they weren't able to, I should also add, create their own industrial pricing program that was as stringent as the federal. So the federal backstop applies in those three regions. In BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, there's a hybrid. So Alberta, for example, has its own emissions or industrial pricing program called TIER, the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Regulation, but the federal carbon levy applies in the province. So it's a bit of a mashup. We actually get some international criticism, I think it's fair to say, because a lot of our systems interprovincially aren't linked. That is a big policy point for IETA. We do believe that intra-provincial fungibility of the systems would be more effective. So that's one thing that we do advocate for. Alberta specifically is pretty interesting. Alberta was the first jurisdiction in not just Canada, but North America to put a price on carbon in 2007. So we even beat British Columbia, which I think surprises a lot of people. As I said, Alberta has TIER, the Technology Innovation and Emission Reduction Regulation. This is interesting in that it is a very mature system, including the offset system within Alberta. All facilities that emit over 100,000 tons of CO2 per year, not companies, but every facility that emits over 100,000 tons is automatically regulated in Alberta, but facilities can opt into the regulation. And I say this because I think it's very interesting because it confused me for a long time. Why the heck would you opt in to be regulated? Well, regulated facilities do not pay the carbon levy. So they don't pay the carbon price on the fuel that they're consuming. Instead, they're paying on the emissions up the stack, essentially, once that fuel is combusted. So it's to avoid the double dipping. At a very, very simplified level, let me explain how the TIER system works. There's a facility, and the dotted line represents the allowable greenhouse gas emissions level. Essentially, the government recognizes that those businesses can operate with a certain level of emissions, and so they have a threshold or a benchmark by which the facility would be required to meet. So if you're above that threshold, it's called your compliance obligation. This is important because you need to understand that there are 3 different ways to meet your compliance obligation. The first, pretty simple, reduce your emissions. Love to see it. Hopefully the carbon price incentivizes companies to reduce their emissions, but I think we can acknowledge that it's a little, it can be a little difficult to reduce internally. It's not always super straightforward. There's project management, there's costs associated with it. So while that's the ultimate outcome, it's not the only option. The second option for a compliance obligation would be to write a check to the government. As I said, the carbon price is $80 per ton. That's great. it's simple. Some of that money does get returned to emission reduction projects, but that company who wrote the check is probably not going to see most of that money again. So the third option is what I think is the best. It offers a cost sort of a flexibility, and that's buying carbon credits. So buying the right to claim the emission reduction that somebody else created outside of your facility. I want to switch gears to the VCM, or the voluntary carbon market. I realize I didn't spell out that acronym. So VCM, voluntary carbon market, and how we see the role. So sorry, my little icons didn't show up. Doesn't really impact the content here. So we see the role of the VCM as threefold. First and primarily, it is a mechanism for corporates to invest their money in emission reductions. And this would be beyond their value chain or outside of their sort of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Some companies will do that in order to be able to make claims, like being carbon neutral or net zero, and we'll get to that in a second. The second role of the VCM is to channel finance where it needs to go. And AIDA has identified that as we need finance to go to the global south, to removals, specifically tech-based removals, to forest conservation, as well as delivery of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is really important, and I think we forget this. Sometimes we get very caught up in what the company or what the buyer of the carbon credits is saying about their climate action, and we forget where the money is going. And that's the more impactful side of these this equation or these conversations. And so it's really important that we recognize the role of the VCM is to channel finance where it needs to go. Finally, we think the role of the voluntary carbon market is to pave the way for compliance markets. The voluntary market is a fraction of the scale of compliance markets, and inherently, it cannot be used as a disciplinary tool. The voluntary market, no company is required to participate in the voluntary market, and so it is going above and beyond any requirements put in place by government. So to have more effective carbon pricing systems, we think that compliance markets are important, and we think the voluntary market plays an important role in getting jurisdictions set up to implement those markets. This data only goes till 2022, but I've included it here to give you a sense of the scale of the market. It's approximately $2 billion per year. Compliance markets are approximately $950 billion per year. So the voluntary market is 1–2% of the compliance market, so total carbon pricing. Compliance markets do have an outsized impact. 2023 data was about flat. We saw similar numbers in 2023, around $2 billion, but we are hoping to grow the market, and there are some projections that the market could grow, I think, 15-fold by 2050. Okay, so now we have a bit of a backgrounder on carbon markets. We're going to get into some offsetting principles. We've been talking a lot about carbon credits, is the topic of the webinar, but I want to make sure we're on the same page and we all know what a carbon credit is. So a carbon credit is 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent that's been reduced, removed, or avoided from entering the atmosphere from an intentional project. And there's two parts of that I want to sort of double click on or highlight. One, it needs to be through an intentional project. You're not able to generate credits for any activity, and that will come through when we're talking about some of the other principles and the accounting principles. But the other is that it's 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. CO2 equivalent comes down to global warming potentials. So this is sort of a measure of the impact of a greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And we use carbon dioxide as the baseline. CO2 has a global warming potential of 1. Methane, for example, has a global warming potential of 28. And it's not nearly as bad as some of the hydrofluorocarbons or the perfluorocarbons that we see in the atmosphere. A lot of refrigerants can be thousands of times worse than CO2 in the atmosphere. But obviously all of these are greenhouse gases. These are actually the Kyoto Protocol greenhouse gases. So when the world first got together and developed the Kyoto Protocol, these were the gases that they identified as problematic and what that protocol was targeting. So how does CO2e work? Essentially, since it is an intensity sort of reference value, if you reduce 1 metric ton of methane, that's equivalent to reducing 28 metric tons of CO2. So we would use CO2e so that we're not writing out tons of methane, tons of nitrous oxide, tons of sulfur hexafluoride. We're leveling it to be tons of CO2 equivalent. So I touched on this before, the role of carbon credits. As you can see, we'll have a facility that in the baseline, the top dotted line would be the baseline of the business as usual scenario. And it has reduced its emissions to the project scenario. The amount that it's reduced, as measured in tons of CO2 equivalent, are carbon credits. And these can be sold to another emitting facility, and there's a flow of money back to the project or the entity that reduced the emissions in the first place. It's important to note that I am a mechanical engineer, and so I am very biased towards technology, but the majority of credits in the market actually come from nature-based projects, keeping trees standing, regenerative agriculture, mangrove restoration, things like that. So it's not often facilities like this that are reducing their emissions, but the concept remains. So I just want to double down and really highlight that this is the most important component of this transaction. It's not this facility buying the carbon credits and saying what they will, it's that money is being moved to reward facilities or landowners who are reducing emissions. So I mentioned carbon neutral and net zero. A lot of debate around these terms in the market, but so I put my little asterisks at the bottom. But what I want to highlight would be one main difference that sort of the consensus is seeing. Carbon neutrality as of right now is when a company reduces their emissions internally and offsets the remainder with carbon credits. Now, carbon neutral doesn't specify whether those carbon credits are reductions in emissions or removals of emissions from the atmosphere. That's sort of the main difference. Some folks who are defining net zero standards say companies can be net zero if they reduce internally and then offset with removals. So a removal would be growing a new tree. That tree is going to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. Versus keeping a tree standing, you're preventing that CO2 being released to the atmosphere when that end product breaks down. Say it was paper. The CO2 would eventually be released. So there's a difference between reductions and removals, and that's typically how we're looking at the difference between carbon neutral and net zero as well. The important part, I'll go back here for a second, the important part is that the company reduces their emissions internally. That's pretty clear consensus that if we want to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, companies do need to be working on decarbonizing their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions themselves, making sure they're not just buying their way out of doing the hard work. And this ties into this concept here of the mitigation hierarchy. So the mitigation hierarchy is in place to encourage companies to avoid new sources of emissions, reduce their emissions that they already have, and then offset the rest or compensate for their emissions through the purchase of carbon credits. So this mitigation hierarchy you will see used quite a bit. And if your company is wondering where to start, I would encourage you to start with the mitigation hierarchy. So when you're developing new projects or new service offerings, how can you avoid increasing your emissions through those? And then looking at your footprint, your scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint, and reducing wherever possible, and then looking at carbon credits. One very important principle when it comes to carbon markets, and whether we're in a compliance system or in the voluntary system, is the avoidance of double counting. So double counting occurs one of 3 ways. double issuance, double claiming, or double use. And double claiming and double use can be pretty similar. So double issuance would occur if the same project was listed twice on the same registry, or the same project area was covered by 2 different projects on 2 different registries. It's important that the facility or the landowner is only generating credits once for the activity, right? If you're double issuing the credits, then the buyer wouldn't necessarily be buying the emission reduction if somebody else already bought it off a different registry. So double issuance very much lays with both the registries, also called carbon crediting programs, also called standards, but also with the project developer to make sure that their project is isolated and only being issued once. Double claiming could occur 2 different ways. This might be if a creator of carbon credits is also counting a reduced footprint, and this is an interesting one, so I'll spend a second on it. If you are running a grocery store, you're obviously going to have a lot of refrigeration. And if you're putting in a low carbon refrigerant to avoid leaks of, say, hydrofluorocarbons that have a very high global warming potential, if you put in a better refrigerant, awesome, you're going to reduce your footprint. But if you're quantifying those emission reductions from that better refrigerant and selling those emission reductions as carbon credits to someone else, they're paying you for the right to claim those emission reductions as their own. They're paying for the claim. Therefore, when you're reporting your footprint, you would need to increase your footprint by the volume of credits that you sold. Otherwise, you would be double claiming the emission reduction, and that would be there's a very interesting conversation around double claiming when it relates to country level and corporate level claims under Article 6. So if an oil and gas company in Calgary is buying voluntary carbon credits from Peru, for example, does Canada count those voluntary credits towards its nationally determined contribution? Or is it only left at the corporate level? Some people say that Canada would have to count those as their own, and therefore Peru would need to increase their inventory, same as a refrigeration company. Peru would need to increase their inventory because Canada would decrease theirs a corresponding amount. Well, in my view, Canada is not counting the oil and gas company's voluntary credits, therefore the inventories are at different levels and they're measuring different things. So a corresponding adjustment wouldn't be required. But a lot of debate around that. Feel free to ask questions if you are curious. Double use, as I said, is pretty similar to double claiming, and this would occur when a carbon credit would be claimed twice. And that's why it's important that registries have infrastructure in place to retire the carbon credit. We say retire, and once a credit's retired, it cannot be traded again, it cannot be used again, so that needs to be functional and publicly available as well. Okay, we're going to get into some details around carbon credit accounting. This is still principles based. As I said, I don't want to show you equations. I don't want you falling asleep on me, but we will go through some key principles. ISO, International Standards Organization, writes very good standards for a variety of industries, the environmental industry included. And the standard that we reference most frequently is 14064. There's actually 3 parts to this standard. So if you're looking at understanding how to do a carbon footprint or an inventory, you'd be looking at 14064-1. If you want to do carbon accounting, be it for a facility under tier or for a carbon offset project, you'd be looking at 14064-2. And if you want to verify project, and that's sort of a standalone auditing role that's done by verification companies, they use 14064-3. So these principles are from 14064-2, and we see these woven throughout the entire carbon pricing system, whether it's compliance market or the voluntary market. There are the 6 principles: consistent, complete, accurate, transparent, conservative, and relevant. And this talks about how we need to think about the data and how we're doing our calculations. So consistent, for example, would be if you're doing a footprint year over year for your company, but you sold one of your assets in the middle of the year, you would not have a very consistent footprint, because it might look like, say you reduce your footprint by 30% by selling that asset. That's not consistent year over year. So you might go back and adjust your previous footprint to show what it would have looked like without that asset, so that a side-by-side comparison could be made. Completeness, pretty simple. Make sure you're including all of the emission sources and sinks. Accuracy is paramount. We want to be as accurate as possible. Accuracy ties into the 5th bullet point there, conservativeness, because when you can't be accurate, we want to be conservative. This is a really, really important principle, and there's some discourse on this as well. So what I mean by that is, say you're calculating your company's footprint and you have all of your utility bills showing your natural gas consumption except for July. Well, you can't be accurate because you don't have the bill for July. So the next best thing would be to be conservative. And what you would do then is you would take, for example, the highest natural gas bill that you had, probably a winter month, and you would take that same value and apply it in July. So you'd be conservative when you can't be accurate. When I was explaining what a carbon credit was and how it needs to come from an intentional project, this is what I mean by project. There's 2 big buckets that we can count in carbon markets, and that would be technology-based solutions, easier to
sorry,
quantify.
Amy, I'm just going to jump in for a second. You're just getting a little bit fuzzy there. Just give me 2 seconds.
I don't know what to do about that.
Okay, no, you're great now. All good. Let's go ahead.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay, so nature-based and technology-based solutions, and these are some examples of the project types. One that you might hear a lot about is REDD+. This was has gone through some scrutiny in the past year or so, last couple of years, and so a lot of the big carbon crediting programs are working on making this more stringent. But REDD is reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, so a conscious effort to keep forests standing. The plus is the non-carbon benefits of these projects, so the conservation and sustainable forest management, the biodiversity, the habitat, things like that, the co-benefits of keeping these forests standing. Another very popular, so REDD+ is very popular in the tropical regions. Improved forest management is more common in Canada and the US. So this is a type that looks at how can we manage our forests better. So cutting down fewer trees, selective tree harvesting, super utilization, so making use of all the trees and the biomass that is being harvested. Improved forest management is important. Deforestation and reforestation, growing trees either where there were no trees before, afforestation, or growing trees where there were trees before but they were all cut down, reforestation. This is very important. This is growing in interest as well, largely because of the removal component. Because again, growing new trees is pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, so that would be considered a carbon removal. Some of the technology-based solutions that are interesting might be renewable energy. It's worth talking about. It's not considered additional anymore, and we'll get into additionality in a second here, but arguably, carbon markets have played a very important role in advancing renewable energy by paying the project developer for putting in place solar and wind. So I think that's actually a very good example of the role that markets can play in transforming some of these systems, like the electricity system. Landfill gas is very interesting, very easy to implement. Not a very charismatic project. You can't take very pretty photos of a landfill, but it's an important one because it's capturing methane from organic decomposition in the landfill and finding a new use for that as natural gas. Flare gas to power, geothermal, waste heat recovery, these are project types that we do see in Alberta. And there's a whole swath of technology-based solutions that I haven't listed here. We're going to deep dive into some of these characteristics of high quality credits, but I wanted to explain them as very important principles that we're going to hear quite a bit as we're talking about quantifying carbon credits. So they need to be real, they need to be additional or beyond business as usual, they need to be permanent, obviously, they need to be on a registry. You cannot just generate credits on your own and try and sell them. Those would be considered pretty low quality credits, and I would strongly advise against. But we'll get into some of the details of that and how they need to be measurable as well. So additionality is one of the most important principles for carbon credits and their quantification. And it's really showing that the project is beyond business as usual, or it goes beyond common practice. Essentially, additionality is trying to prove that the project would not have occurred if it weren't for the absence of the incentive provided by carbon credits. So it can be determined multiple ways. Regulatory and legal additionality is very consistent across the board. If there's a law or a regulation or a directive that requires the activity to occur, you cannot get carbon credits for it. Now, there are some exceptions where the law is not being applied. Orphan wells is a very interesting example of that. But regulatory surplus or legal additionality is always considered by projects. Financial additionality is the easiest to explain, but it's not the only way that additionality is determined. Financial additionality is whether the project needed the revenue from the carbon credits in order to occur. It makes a lot of sense, right? Did you need the money? Okay, well, that proves it would be beyond business as usual, or it wouldn't have occurred anyway. However, it's difficult to prove. What is an acceptable rate of return, right? We don't have that defined, and so financial additionality can be challenging to verify. Technical barriers means projects that are first of kind will typically be considered automatically additional. Institutional barriers are interesting, and this might be an energy company, for example, that's never used carbon capture and storage before, and they're having to learn how to get a well permit and figure out injection and figure out the carbon capture technology. So there would be institutional barriers. That would mean they'd be more likely to be allowed to generate credits. Penetration rate is, I think, a fantastic way to look at additionality. In Alberta, it's 40%, 40. So once 40% of the industry or the market is doing this activity, that's when it's considered common practice. And a positive list is the last one here. A positive list is where the carbon crediting program has predetermined that certain activities would be acceptable. So for example, Verra, who's a carbon crediting program in the voluntary carbon market, they have a methodology for electric vehicle charging. So displacing grid electricity or displacing gasoline and diesel with EV charging. They've determined through a positive list any state that has less than 5% uptake of EVs in the general population, the EV charging would meet the positive list requirements and would be considered automatically additional. So the positive list threshold is typically a lot lower than the penetration rate threshold. Okay, so permanence is very important. And this is an important, I would say, protection for the buyer of the credit who needs an assurance that they're putting money towards a carbon crediting project, they know that those emission reductions are permanent and they're not going to be reversed. So there's intentional reversals and unintentional reversals. And the biggest risk for both of these would be from what we call leaky reservoirs, such as forests. We're not referring to like a saline aquifer as a leaky reservoir, because we're not talking about physical leaks. But there's a few different ways to ensure permanence, and this is important mostly for removal type credits, where the CO2 is being moved and could be moved back to the atmosphere. We typically don't talk about permanence for reduction type credits, though forestry is the exception. So buffer pools are one way to ensure permanence. And this is where a portion of the credits from the project go to a separate account. And then if there is a reversal, say a forest fire, credits from the buffer pool will be retired in an equivalent volume to the tons of CO2 that were released. Buffer pools could be used temporarily for intentional reversals. So if a landowner has promised not to cut down their trees for 100 years, and then the price of timber goes through the roof, and they just couldn't resist and they cut down their trees, okay, that's not all right, because there were requirements in place for them to, commit to that 100-year period. And so they'd be required to pay back those emission reductions. Both of these are based on sort of the risk factors to reduce the sort of higher risk of permanence, but we are typically talking about this in terms of forest carbon. Okay, leakage and functional equivalence are, I think, very interesting components of carbon accounting. Carbon leakage, again, not talking about physical leaks. We're talking about, was there an increase in emissions elsewhere based on the project activity? So I think one of the best ways to describe this is with an analogy to plastics. If you run a milkshake shop and you want to get rid of plastic straws, awesome, great, right? That's good for the environment. But if you end up designing a lid that you can sip your milkshake without using a straw, but if that lid has more plastic in it than the previous lid and straw combo, you've gotten rid of straws, awesome, but you're now using more plastic. We'd call that leakage. And so leakage is taken very seriously. And in forest carbon, for example, we want to make sure that if there's a company who owns 2 forests side by side and they promise to protect one forest, that they can't just go and harvest an equivalent amount more from their second forest. So that's factored into the accounting. Very significant discounts would be applied to their total emissions reductions, and the crediting program would check how much they are harvesting in the leakage band or in the reference area. Functional equivalence is a term, it's not commonly used, but I do think it's important. The facility must have the same output after project implementation as before. So you cannot have a big industrial engine, turn the engine down 50%, and then say, oh, we reduced our emissions by 50%, because the output is not functionally the same. The output is 50% less of what it was before. So both of those tie together, and they're important considerations. When we are looking at quantifying emission reductions, ERs, emission reductions, you look at what was the baseline, how many emissions were occurring before you implemented the project, and then you subtract the project emissions. So very simply, a carbon capture and storage project, maybe there was an ethanol facility that was emitting 1 million tons of CO2 per year. Your baseline would then be 1 million tons of CO2 going into the atmosphere. Now, if you're capturing that CO2, moving it along a pipeline and injecting it into a saline aquifer or an underground reservoir, that might take 20 to 25% of your baseline emissions in order to do. So your project emissions might be 200, 250,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So the amount of emission reductions you get is not 1 million, because you captured 1 million tons. Your total emission reductions, or your carbon credits, would be 750 to 800,000. It'd be the net. You can only get emission reductions for the net emission enhancement. If you are looking at designing a carbon crediting project, think data first. This actually ties into an interesting theme we're seeing where verification is moving away from verifying data to verifying data collection systems. And this is because the data requirements in order to generate credits or even to do your footprint or your inventory on your own, it's very data intensive. So definitely think about the data that's required, look into the methodologies, the quantification roadmaps, essentially, and make sure you're well set up. Typically, when these are being verified as well, there's a materiality threshold of 5%. So there could be some error in your calculations, but you always want to minimize it, and it has to be lower than 5%. Absolute error. So verification, I wanted to touch on this quickly, and I think this is one of my last slides here. If you are going to do a carbon offset project, a carbon crediting project, it does need to be third-party verified. Verifiers are, again, they're typically a small engineering company, and they will check that your project meets all the requirements in the standard, they meet all the requirements in the methodology, you have data to back up all of your calculations, and that your calculations and your baseline and your project scenario and your additionality, that those are all robust and defensible. So verifiers, again, they'll follow the ISO 14064-3 standard, and they will complete the verification to what we call a reasonable level of assurance. They can't guarantee absolute assurance. No one would audit something and say it's 100% perfect, but a reasonable level of assurance is essentially how close can we get to that and be confident in our answer. So verifications will typically include a site visit, so going to see that your forest is still standing, or going to see that your carbon capture equipment is functioning and operational. So verification will look at not just all of the desktop, but they'll actually look at the emissions activity itself. Verification is a very, very important step, and whether you're doing your footprint or, again, doing a carbon project or doing your emissions inventory modeling for a regulation like TIER, you're going to need verification, and it is very important. It was my last slide. Awesome. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Wonderful presentation, Amy. Thank you so much. I think that was incredibly informative. We do have a few questions. The first one is coming out of Vancouver, and they're asking, how do SMEs balance the financial costs associated with carbon offsetting against their operational priorities? Are there any financing mechanisms or partnerships that have proven effective for SMEs?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it would depend on whether you're looking at that from a compliance or a voluntary perspective. Coming out of Vancouver, probably voluntary, since BC is just putting in place their output-based pricing system, because using offsets in a compliance system, like BC's upcoming output-based pricing system, is going to be a lower cost than paying the carbon price to the government. So that would actually be a cost flexibility mechanism that would be beneficial. In a voluntary market, this is where we have a lot of debate on this topic, is how can companies afford to do this? It is important to note that voluntary credits are typically a lot lower cost than compliance credits. I think in the range of $2 to $30 per ton. So it would be an expenditure, it would be expensive. I'm not aware of any grants or programs that would support a company in its voluntary endeavors when it comes to carbon credits. It would need to be a conscious effort from the company to invest money outside of their value chain in order to, do the right thing, take responsibility for their footprint, or maybe even meet sort of stakeholder or investor demands.
Very interesting. We have just kind of a basic question, actually, that's jumping off of this one from Ashwini. And they're asking, could you please explain voluntary versus compliance markets?
Yes.
Right off the bat, yes.
Yeah, great question. So compliance markets are government run. They're required by government regulation, whether at the national or at the subnational scale. Voluntary markets are not government run. And that sounds silly to say because it is very basic, but the voluntary market exists as really a bottom-up endeavor with all of these companies participating in order to facilitate the market. There is interesting overlap between voluntary and compliance markets. So some countries are now allowing what were traditionally voluntary carbon credits to be used within their tax scheme. So Colombia, Singapore, South Africa, for example, if you have a compliance obligation under the compliance market, those countries will allow you to take a voluntary carbon credit and retire it against your tax obligation. So we're also seeing the opposite, where compliance carbon credits are being used in the voluntary market. So British Columbia, for example, has made a conscious effort that carbon credits developed in British Columbia could be sold for voluntary purposes. So we're sort of seeing that flow of credits going both ways. But at the base level, to answer your question, compliance markets are run by the government, voluntary markets are not.
That's very interesting. We have a question coming from back east, and they're asking, what role do standards play in ensuring transparency and credibility in voluntary carbon markets, especially for SMEs that might lack experience in this area? And then there's a two-parter to this, and they're asking, how is double counting regulated?
Role of standards and double counting.
Yeah.
I have a poor memory, but I do have sticky notes. Okay. The role of standards is very, very, very important. And a standard is, we're trying to shift the language towards calling them carbon crediting programs. So the big ones would be Verra, Climate Action Reserve, ACR, or Gold Standard. They're sort of known as the big four programs. They set out rules and requirements, things like how will additionality be determined. They run the registry. They'll set rules around a crediting period, or how many years can you generate credits for. They also publish methodologies. And I touched on this, or I mentioned it, but didn't dive into it. Methodologies, also called protocols, are the roadmap, or they're the set of instructions on how you're going to generate and quantify your carbon credits. So the programs or the standards that are developing the methodologies need to be very careful that those methodologies are accurate, they're robust, that they're complete in covering all of the relevant emission sources. So the role of standards is very important in that regard. Double counting, to go to the second question, how is double counting prevented, regulated, ensured? Typically during verification. So there are some initiatives like the Climate Action Data Trust or the CAD Trust that is trying to create a meta registry where every single credit in the world would be shown, so that once it's retired, it can't be reopened and resold. That's still in progress. So as of right now, double counting is ensured through verification. So the verifier would check the other major registries to check that the project isn't listed elsewhere. They would also look to make sure that the issuer of the carbon credits, not the issuer, sorry, the project owner who's implemented the crediting activity, that they're not also claiming the emission reduction as their own.
So some real standards there and some real policies. That's very interesting. Now, I have a question for you just about the future. So looking ahead, what trends or developments do you anticipate in the voluntary carbon market space that could impact SMEs? And how should SMEs prepare to adapt to these changes that might be forthcoming?
Yeah. So, okay, I want to say claims and regulation. So I'd say that there's three trends that are worth talking about here. One around claims that buyers of credits can make, one around types of credits, namely removals, and one around increasing regulation. So a trend that would be specifically relevant to SMEs would be around claims. And I touched on carbon neutral and net zero, and I would suggest that you don't use them. they've become they've become very contentious as terms, and there's a lot of sort of expectations and sort of negative connotations associated with them. The trend that we're seeing is towards what I call narrative claims. So a narrative claim would be saying, my company purchased 10,000 tons of CO2e from X project. Our footprint is 10,000 tons. Therefore, we have compensated for 100% of our emissions, right? Tell a story with what you're doing rather than trying to say climate positive, carbon neutral, instead of putting a label on it, go with a narrative claim. The second trend we're seeing, I suppose this might be less relevant for SMEs, but we are seeing a push towards removal credits. So reductions, again, a reduction in the emissions from the baseline to the project, and removal is purely pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. There are some proponents in the market who think pulling the CO2 out of the atmosphere is more valuable. I'm pushing back against this because every ton that we reduce is 1 ton that doesn't need to be removed later. And we very clearly need both at the same time. So something to keep an eye on, though, is that some folks are saying removals. The third trend that probably is more relevant to SMEs related to the voluntary market is an increasing sense of regulation of the voluntary market. So governments actually getting involved in setting regulations related to voluntary climate action. We're seeing this being driven by California and the EU. So California has released some regulations lately looking at disclosures. So companies that are selling credits in California, are they disclosing all of the relevant calculation information and pricing information? And there's a whole set of what will be required under this bill. The EU is looking at it from a slightly different angle, looking to protect consumers. So they have the Green Claims Directive, Consumer Protection Directive, and the Green Claims Directive, making sure that companies aren't making misleading claims. Super important. But it's interesting as a trend to see how the government is stepping in and making requirements related to the voluntary market and voluntary activity. So something to keep an eye on for SMEs. I'm not anticipating voluntary regulations to come into place in Canada. We're seeing that Canada is just more focused on the compliance market. But if you are an SME that's looking to use the voluntary market, definitely take a peek at that, or definitely keep an eye out for that alongside any compliance obligations that you have.
Well, it sounds like a very interesting future when it comes to carbon capture with our SMEs. I suggest everyone that's watched this webinar to reach out to Amy with any of their consulting needs. And I just wanted to say a great heartfelt thank you to Amy for putting on this presentation today. Wonderful job. And I think it was very informative to everyone that was on the call. So thank you very much. You can reach out to Amy or to Eco Canada, and you will get this recording in your inbox within 24 hours. Again, thank you, Amy. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.